Okay, welcome back to week 6, American Literature, a genre study of mystery fiction. And this week we're going to talk a little bit about some of the comparison and contrast between our 3 stories, which will be part of your research paper during the consultation week. So let's talk a little bit about the timeline between these stories. So Poe writes his first story in 1843. So Doyle writes his first story about 50 years later in 1887. So the time lag between them is almost 2 generations. And a lot can change during that time, especially in terms of language use. Of course, Poe is American and Doyle being British. That in itself has some different linguistic pieces to it. And our story, Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie, isn't published until 1934. So we're talking another 50 years between Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot. So between the 3 of them, we're talking about a timeline of about 100 years. And that's huge in terms of technology. During Hercule Poirot's time, 1934, we have cars, we have radio, we have streetlights everywhere. Doyle's time, Sherlock Holmes, no cars. Streetlights are starting to show up in major cities. A cab back then is horse-drawn. And back in Poe's time, there is nothing going on with electricity. And you do get around by horse carriage. Another point is that all of the detectives in all 3 of our stories are European. The first American detective series doesn't really show up until 1925, about the same time as Agatha Christie's stories. But it's actually a series called Charlie Chan Detective Series. And that's written by a Harvard University graduate and journalist, Earl Biggers, and we will talk about him a little later in our lecture. Let's do a little comparison about the use of description in the 3 texts. Poe describes things basically. Doyle, very much so, starts describing things, actually putting you right in the scene, right in the place. You can picture it in your mind. And Christie goes even further with her descriptive style of things. More of a woman's touch, a lot more emphasis on clothing, fashion, color, senses, that sort of thing. So even in terms of the use of description in the text, very different for each of our 3 stories. We could take a look at the 3 detectives. just in their physical appearance. Of course, Dupin, our first one, sort of middle age, wealthy, smokes a pipe. Sherlock Holmes kind of steals that from Dupin. Sherlock Holmes, again, maybe a little younger, starting out in the series, carries on for many years. Poe Dupin is only in 3 stories. Sherlock Holmes is in more than 50. Hercule Poirot, of course, he is not what you'd really call a physical specimen of a fit, strong man. He's kind of just the opposite. He's older, overweight. He's very fashionable. He would care more about getting a mud stain on his shoes than anything else. So, in terms of just physical appearances, all 3 of our detectives are almost diametrically apart. The detective styles of our 3 different detectives. Augustin Dupin, yeah, he's kind of a wealthy guy. He doesn't really do it for money per se, but he will take money if it's offered. He kind of takes on the cases. He might owe somebody a favor, so he'll do it for that. Sherlock Holmes, on the other hand, he will take on cases for money. It is his livelihood, and he is a little selective about his cases, but we'll get into that in a second. And Hercule Poirot is, okay, so we meet him on the Murder on the Orient Express, and he doesn't take a case for money, motivation, unless he wants to do it. He's basically all set in life. He has enough money to take care of what he needs to live and for all of his little extravagant expenses that he likes. The motivations, again, differ wildly. Again, Dupin takes it maybe for something to do, but kind of help out the police, but maybe he owes somebody a favor, so he'll do it for that. Holmes does do it for money, but he really chooses his cases because he is so driven to be active mentally, solving a puzzle. And as it says in the canon, if he doesn't have things to do, he becomes depressive, takes drugs, anything to alleviate the pain of boredom. Again, Hercule Poirot, at this point in life, he just takes on the cases that he thinks are of interest to himself. Okay, so that's just a kind of a real quick compare contrast of some of our detectives, some of the thoughts you might want to think about in that research paper coming up. And there's a lot more. Okay. Just real quick, let's talk about the settings of the 3 stories. So, all Dupin's stories take place in Paris. Sherlock Holmes' stories generally all take place in and around London, except our story, Study in Scarlet, is two parts. First part taking place in London, but kind of a flashback to the American West, the Oregon Trail, and Salt Lake City, Utah, traveling throughout America's smaller cities, then again back to Europe. St. Petersburg is mentioned, Copenhagen, Paris, and then finally back to London. And in the story, The Murder on the Orient Express, we are looking at a starting point in Aleppo, Syria, going on to eventually being snowbound in Yugoslavia. So just some ideas to kind of put you in the framework for that research paper. So we started to talk last week a little bit of an introduction to the Orient Express, and a couple of little differences along the way. It depends what you did. If you read the text verbatim, or if you watched the 1974 movie, the starting point is the same, but in the movie, Poirot is in Syria and he takes a boat to Istanbul. In the written text, he takes a train. Nevertheless, along the way, he meets a couple of our initial characters, Colonel Arbuthnot and Mary Debenham. Poirot has a way of kind of eavesdropping in on people's conversations and remembering them. But nevertheless, the conversation is the same in either setting. And he overhears them saying something about, wait, this is not a good time. We'll do this after all the nasty business is over. Okay, so he kind of files that in his memory banks. Either by boat or by train, he is escorted by a French military lieutenant until he gets to Istanbul. And he is kind of warned by the lieutenant that there is bad weather expected to come across the Balkans in Europe. He does make some comments about Mary Debenham. In the book, he sees her in the dining car going from Aleppo, Syria to Turkey. And he makes a notice that he thinks she's about 28 years old. And she has a cool efficiency about her, which makes her seem well-traveled. He kind of admires her features, but thinks she's a little too efficient to be pretty. Again, he eavesdrops on their conversation, but he figures that he's really not being noticed by either of them. He speculates that he's only some damn foreigner in their eyes, and would never notice him anyway or care. In the story, there is a lot of stereotype references about Americans, about British, about foreign people. You'll pick those up as you're reading through it. So again, Poirot has a real habit of eavesdropping into people's conversations. He eventually does get to Istanbul. He goes to the hotel. He gets a telegram. He is then requested to return to London. There's a development in the Kasnar case, which is really meaningless to our story, but nevertheless, he's got to get back to London as soon as possible, even though he planned to stay a night or two. So he cancels his room and he books travel on the Orient Express to London. He's waiting to board the train. In the hotel, he meets an old friend, Monsieur Bach, a fellow Belgian, and who just happens to be the director of the train company. So they're sitting there chatting away. Poirot observes two American men in the restaurant, one older and one younger. The older man is bald, and Poirot thinks he might be a philanthropist. But when the man looks over and makes eye contact with Poirot, he sees small and crafty eyes. He feels a strange malevolence coming from this person across the way. The old man tells the younger to pay a bill. His voice is kind of, he says, queer, soft, and dangerous voice. The young man agrees and calls the older man Mr. Ratchett. So Monsieur Bach escorts Poirot to the Orient Express train. And when they get to the train, they find out that it's entirely full, which is very odd for this time of year. Even the secret compartment that's always saved and reserved has been taken. So he was able to find a room with a man who hasn't yet come to the train yet, Mr. Harris. And it's a second class berth. But it's a shared berth, and he's sharing it with a man named Hector McQueen, who was the younger American from the hotel restaurant talking to Ratchett. The next day, Poirot joins Bach, and they are sitting together, eavesdropping, making comments about the 13 passengers in the dining car, guessing, jobs, nationalities, that sort of thing, relationships, whatever. So the nationalities of the passengers are quite extensive. There are Americans, English, Hungarian, German, Italian. Later we find out Russian. So we have quite a cast of characters here. Ratchett approaches Poirot and sits down. He identifies Poirot from newspapers and so forth. Poirot is kind of a famous guy. And he offers Poirot a job promising big money. He says that he has received threats on his life, and he wants Poirot to ensure his safety. They have kind of a verbal interchange. Poirot says, what? Only one threat on your life? Men that have one threat on their life usually have many threats on their lives. So, nevertheless, Ratchett makes the deal, raises the amount of money. Poirot's not interested. Ratchett wants him to say straight out, why are you refusing to work for me? And Poirot responds, I don't like your face. And he leaves. So it doesn't look like Ratchett's going to get any help from Poirot. So the train pulls into Belgrade, and Poirot gets his own cabin, and Bach moves to an adjacent train car that's only occupied by a Greek doctor. As the night approaches, Poirot and Bach both notice that barriers are breaking down and passengers are becoming more comfortable with each other, which is usual on any long journey trip like that. Yeah, you come in on your own, but very soon you start talking with the other people that you're sharing this experience with. So nothing out of the ordinary here. He overhears the colonel, but not talking at length to Hector McQueen about politics. Mrs. Hubbard takes under her wing the Swedish woman, offering her aspirin for her headache. Mrs. Hubbard is quite a talker. If you do the movie scene or the audiobook, she is quite the talker about her daughter, mostly. My daughter says this, my daughter thinks that. Yeah. Okay, Mrs. Hubbard kind of gossips with Poirot about Ratchett, noting that she says she wouldn't be surprised if that man turned out to be a murderer. And she's concerned because her compartment is right next to Ratchett's. Poirot just kind of listening to it all, and he retires to his new cabin, which is on the other side of Ratchett's cabin. So Poirot falls asleep. He's awoken later when he hears a loud groan, and he notices that the train has stopped. He looks out his cabin doorway down the hallway, and he sees the conductor, Pierre Michel, checking on Ratchett. And a voice responds in French that everything is okay. So the conductor's knocking on Ratchett's door, everything okay, in French. And a voice replies in French, yeah, everything's okay. I'm just having a nightmare. Now this is odd because Ratchett doesn't speak anything but English. So we've got our first little clue here, what might be going on. Nevertheless, Poirot can't fall back to sleep. He rings the bell for the conductor. He hears a nearby bell ringing a few times. The conductor goes to that first bell, and Perot overhears a conversation between the conductor and Mrs. Hubbard, mostly Mrs. Hubbard talking. When the conductor does arrive, the conductor explains to Perot that Mrs. Hubbard believes she saw a man in her cabin, and the conductor couldn't really calm her down, and that the train has been stalled between stations in Yugoslavia. Perot is just about ready to fall back to sleep, and he hears a thud noise next door. He goes out, looks out the doorway into the hallway, and he sees a woman wearing a scarlet kimono walking by with her back to him, with a couple of dragons on the back of the kimono. The next morning, there's a big commotion because the train is stopped indefinitely in a blizzard. The train manager, Perot's friend, Mr. Bach, calls on Perot and tells him that Mr. Ratchett was stabbed to death last night. They call the doctor, the Greek doctor, Dr. Constantine, and the three of them go into Ratchett's room, and they estimate that the murder takes place between 12 and 2 in the morning. The revelation that the murder occurred sometime late the previous night and early that morning throws the details to Perot, and he's got something to work with, but we'll get into a little bit more detail about that later. Further details of the murder follow. Ratchett was discovered by the conductor at 11 that morning, but his door was locked and bolted. A window was open onto the snow, but it seems impossible for anyone to have entered or exited because the snow was so deep, but maybe. It looked like initially Ratchett was stabbed about 12 to 15 times with apparent savagery. Well, that changes a little bit when we take a closer look. Mr. Bach employs Perot to take the case. This is an embarrassment for their line, the Orient Express, which is famous around the world. Perot agrees. He's kind of bored, so why not? It's initially concluded that no one could have exited the murder scene since the train was stopped in the snow, but who knows? But if that's the case, then that means the murderer could still be on the train. So Perot is kind of introducing himself as a detective, which he is. Eventually, he collects all the guests' passports, and he'll start eventually to interview each of the guests. He runs into McQueen and tells him the news that Ratchett has been murdered, and McQueen doesn't seem to be surprised. In fact, he says, so they got him after all. And McQueen explains his history with Ratchett, relating the story of how he joined Ratchett as a personal secretary, since Ratchett was hampered by knowing no languages. Okay. Ratchett doesn't know any languages. Why is he speaking French to the conductor? Interesting. So McQueen tells Perot that Ratchett has received several threatening letters written in an over-the-top style. It says, quote, "We're going to get you, see?" The most recent letter was just a few days ago. Perot looks at the letter and he thinks it was written by multiple people, but he doesn't seem impressed otherwise. After some probing, McQueen reveals he knows little of Ratchett's life and history, but he can't pretend to have any affection for him. As these interviews continue a little later, it's kind of funny at the end of each interview that Perot and Bach discuss the guilt of each person. And Bach pretty much thinks that every one of them is guilty, but we'll get into that a little later. So again, they're kind of back looking more closely at Ratchett's body in his cabin. And Dr. Constantine concludes that Ratchett was stabbed exactly 12 times. But some of the blows are glancing, while others were very deep. They discover that some were delivered by the left hand and some by the right hand. So what's going on here? This means there could have been two people involved in the murder. But we're just speculating at this point. Perot searches the cabin. He finds a loaded gun under Ratchett's pillow. He finds a mixture of sleeping medication nearby. He finds a handkerchief with the initial H on it. And he finds a pipe cleaner and a watch stopped at exactly 12:45. He also finds a scrap of burnt paper, which reveals the name Daisy Armstrong. This starts to lead us a little deeper into the case, maybe providing a motivation. So he's dining with Monsieur Bach and Dr. Constantine. Perot announces that he's discovered that Mr. Ratchett's real name is Cassetti, the man responsible for the murder of Daisy Armstrong. Again, as we talked about earlier, Daisy Armstrong is just a replacement for the Lindbergh baby kidnapping and murder, which really took place in New Jersey in America at about the same time. So Cassetti was the man who did it, and he escaped justice on a technical inaccuracy. So Perot concludes that the murdered Mr. Ratchett was actually this Cassetti from America, having fled to Europe and changed his name. So again, Perot begins to call the passengers for interviews to give their accounts of the previous night and early morning. And I'm going to leave you off here at this point so that in your reading for next week, you might be able to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. So here again, up to your own devices. If you want to and can get a hold of the 1974 movie, Murder on the Orient Express, it pretty much follows the book precisely. There's also the audiobook available, which I've given you, and the exact text story. So up to you. Do a little of this, a little of that, however you like to learn. That's up to you. Just get through the second half, and we'll talk about that more next week. So on our next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the inspiration for Murder on the Orient Express and Agatha Christie, kind of a backdrop to the story itself. So that's it for this slide, and we'll move on to our next slide from here. Okay, so what was the inspiration for the Murder on the Orient Express? Agatha Christie wrote her famous detective novel based on an even more famous kidnapping, Orient Express train, circa 1883, by Natalie Escobar, from the SmithsonianMag.com website, November 2017. In Agatha Christie's crime novel Murder on the Orient Express, a well-mustachioed Belgian detective, Hercule Poirot, solves the grisly stabbing of an American tycoon traveling on a long-distance passenger train, while the 1934 story, adopted from a new movie of murder and revenge on a stuck, snowed-in train, is of course the work of fiction. Christie pulled parts of her story straight from the headlines. The true history of the Orient Express. In Christie's story, Poirot is on the Orient Express from Syria to London, where a man named Ratchett asks Poirot to investigate the death threats he's been receiving. Poirot declines, telling Ratchett he doesn't like his face. The next morning, a snowdrift stops the train in its tracks, and Ratchett is found stabbed to death in his compartment. When Poirot steps back into his detective role and searches Ratchett's compartment for clues, he finds a scrap of burnt paper that reads, quote, "Member Little Daisy Armstrong." He deduces that Ratchett is really a mobster named Cassetti, who kidnapped the 3-year-old heiress Daisy Armstrong and collected $200,000 in ransom from her parents before her dead body was discovered. A wealthy man, he was able to escape conviction and flee the country. The narrative of the book centers around who on the train murdered Ratchett. Daisy Armstrong's fictional case probably rang familiar to readers in the mid-1930s who had followed national coverage of the kidnapping of the baby son of famed aviator Charles Lindbergh. Christie's official website confirms that the author lifted the idea for the subplot from the true-life tragedy. On March 1st, 1932, the 20-month-old child disappeared from his crib. A ransom note affixed to the nursery window of their New Jersey home demanded $50,000. The Lindbergh kidnapping threw the country into a kind of frenzy. Newspapers literally stopped the presses to break the news for the morning edition. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover mobilized agents to help state authorities in the search. One Hearst reporter, Alda Rogers St. John, recalled in her autobiography, quote, "Remember little Lindy was everybody's other baby, or if they had none, their only child, kidnapped. The Lindbergh baby. Who would dare?" In both the novel and real life, the children's bodies were discovered after the ransom was paid in full. Cassetti killed Daisy shortly after kidnapping her, and Charles Jr.'s body was found 4 miles from the Lindbergh estate. A tree mover had stumbled across a human skull sticking out from a shallow grave. The body had been decomposed there for 2 months, with a fractured skull and a hole over his right ear. The book was hugely popular when it was released, and Lindbergh, except Robert Zorn, says that the parallels between Daisy and Charles Jr. must have been obvious to people. The parallels are too striking, he says. Agatha Christie even had her own insights about the case. She suspected that the kidnapping was done by a foreigner. A hunch proved correct when the culprit was discovered to be German immigrant Richard Hauptmann. I think she had a better sense of getting to the heart of this than a lot of the investigators, he says. Like the novel's characters, Christie also knew what it was like to be stuck on a train. She loved traveling on the Orient Express and would bring her typewriter along. On one 1931 ride, the train stopped because of a flood. Quote, "My darling, what a journey," she wrote in a letter to her second husband, Max Mallowan. "Started out from Istanbul in a violent thunderstorm. We went very slowly during the night, and about 3 a.m. stopped altogether." She was also inspired by an incident from 1929 when the Orient Express was trapped by snow for 5 days. The story of the Lindbergh baby captured the popular imagination in a way that a book never could. As Joyce Milton wrote in her autobiography of the Lindberghs, Loss of Eden, 1932, was a terrifying time. The country was in the throes of the Great Depression. The Hoovervilles were a common sight. World War I, and the war to end all wars, hadn't prevented the creeping rise of totalitarian regimes like fascism and Nazism. Americans couldn't help but wonder what the world had come to. Not even the baby of a national hero was safe from kidnappers, and a popular jingle at the time, "Who Stole the Lindbergh Baby?" pondered who would do such a thing. "After he crosses the ocean wide" was the way to show our pride, the song's lyrics asked. Was it you? Was it you? Was it you? As for Perrault himself, Christie never specified a real-life inspiration for her famous character. However, researcher Michael Clapp believes her Belgian detective might have lived right down the street from her. While looking into his own family history, Clapp discovered that Christie had met a retired Belgian policeman turned war refugee named Jacques Hornias at a charity event benefiting refugees from Belgium. It is not definitive proof, Clapp told the Telegraph, but it's quite a coincidence. In the author's own autobiography, though, She says that Perrault was indeed inspired by one of her Belgian neighbors. Why not make my detective a Belgian, I thought. There were all types of refugees, Christie wrote. How about a refugee police officer? Using real-life inspirations for Perrault and Orient Express were far from unusual for Christie. In fact, lots of personal experiences left their mark on her stories. Whether it was her knowledge of poisonings through her work with the British Red Cross, or her fascination with a rubella outbreak that inspired the mirror cracked from side to side, her imagination ran wild, as she in her autobiography, and she didn't shy away from letting everyday life inspire her. Plots to me, at such odd moments when I am walking along the street or examining a hat shop, she wrote, suddenly a splendid idea comes into my head. References and allusions. Main article, The Lindbergh Kidnapping. The kidnapping and murder of Charles Lindbergh's son in 1932 inspired that element in Christie's novel 2 years later. The novel used many elements of real-life case. A young child, firstborn of the family, was kidnapped for ransom directly from the crib. The parents were famous, the father was a well-known pilot, and the mother pregnant, and the ransom was paid, but the child found dead soon after. An innocent but perhaps loose-lipped maid employed by Lindbergh's parents was suspected of involvement in the crime. After being harshly interrogated by police, she committed suicide. Two less notable events inspired her novel. Christie's first journey on the Orient Express in 1928, and a blizzard in Turkey that marooned an Orient Express for 6 days, just a few months later in February 1929. Flooding from the rainfall that washed sections of the track away in December 1931 halted Christie's return from her husband's archaeological dig at Niviaf aboard an Orient Express for 24 hours. Her authorized biography details that event in a complete quotation of a letter to her husband, which describes several passengers on her train who inspired both the plot and the characters in her novel, including an American, Mrs. Hilton, who inspired Mrs. Hubbard. Mrs. Hubbard. Characters in the story. Other passengers include Greek Dr. Constantine, English governess Mary Debenham, Mrs. Hubbard, an opinionated American matron, Princess Dragomir and her German maid Hildegard Schmidt, Swedish missionary Greta Olson, vulgar American businessman Ratchett, his secretary and translator Hector McQueen, and valet Edward Henry Masterman, Count and Countess Andreani, talkative gentle giant Italian Antonio Foscarelli, American salesman Cyrus B. Hardman, English Colonel Arbuthnot, and the conductor Pierre Michel. Okay, so that's a good start as to the background of our story, Murder on the Orient Express. Okay, let's take a look at this article here. The critical analysis, Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. This article was written by Simran Singh from the owlcation.com website. The cultural context. Crime fiction was a popular genre due to the way it served as a form of escapism from the stress of the world wars. As P.D. James stated, quote, "What the detective story is about is not murder, but the restoration of order." This is reflected through the common characteristics of the genre. This includes suspense, several murders, detectives attempting to track of the murder's next move, a complex plot, and a psychological approach to the reading character's personality and behavior. Societal views and ideas reflected in the genre include of justice, truth, law, and order. The outcome served to the villain of the story is often perceived to be justice. However, the idea of justice is challenged within Christie's novel, as the murderers of the primary villain do not receive punishment for their actions. This contradicted the social norms of the genre, where books such as The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle ended with the murderer being brought to justice. This perception of justice supports the growing trend of vigilantism within the time period. This is seen with movies such as The Mark of Zorro, Robin Hood, and texts such as Zorro by Johnson Macaulay. The war was a devastating effect on citizens' faith in the law and God, which made vigilantism appealing in popular culture. Resources were depleted, hysteria was caused due to mass deaths, and the seemingly endless war of attrition hurting the economy. The pain manifests incarnations into the spirit of vengeance present within this book. The work alludes to the French Revolution in 1789, where the people's justice included killing the higher classes and the monarchy. Like how the monarchy escaped prosecution due to their money and status. The murderer Ratchett does the same with his wealth and the secret hold he had over various persons to be acquitted from his murder of young Daisy. The failure of the law is expressed in how Ratchett was able to change his name from Cassetti to Ratchett and go traveling. So in the same vengeful revolutionary spirit, Daisy's family murders Ratchett. Technique. Techniques such as juxtaposition, allusions, and symbolism are utilized to challenge the audience's perception of law and justice. Ratchett's characterization symbolically paints him as the epitome of evil. The characters continually mention how his murder of a child makes deserving of death. Furthermore, his character is symbolic of who the French Revolution revolted against. The rich who bought their way out of condemnation and held themselves above the law. To reflect the character's distrust of God's power, Franz Schmidt states God should not allow terrible events such as child murders to occur. The monarchy also created the narrative of being appointed by God. Thus, to twist the monarchy's narration into irony, Daisy's family uses Christian allusion to imply they are working for a power higher than the judicial system. Juxtaposition is used between an early scene where a woman is stoned to death for adultery and the scene where the Armstrong family's murder is exposed. Hercule Poirot defends this law, despite grimacing at the barbarity of her punishment. Yet when the family comes together to ritualistically stab Ratchett in the name of vigilante justice, Hercule Poirot condemns the crime. Why does he defend the barbarity of the law's justice and reject the people's justice toward a murderer the law failed to catch? Ironically, in the end, Poirot puts aside his Kantian belief in relation to the law and passively agrees with the murder by allowing the family to get away with the crime. Another allusion includes the number of people who stab Ratchett, 12. The number 12 is a Christian allusion to the 12 apostles enacting God's work, and is the number of people needed for a jury. This confronts and challenges the audience perception of juries, and why would one consider their form of justice as barbarity and not the U.S. legal system. This also makes the audience question whether it's right to use the name of God in the name of justice, which was a common occurrence in law and governing systems. As a result, Christie uses a variety of techniques to challenge the norms of the legal system, confronts both Poirot and the audience with the ethics regarding the law being just. Okay, so that's a quick analysis of our story, Murder on the Orient Express. Okay, I wanted to talk about Agatha Christie's other detective, Miss Marple. And Miss Marple was a British television series, murder mystery novels by Agatha Christie. And there were many women that starred in the role of Miss Marple through the years. It aired from 26th of December 1984 until 1992 on BBC. But America has a counterpart to BBC called PBS, which comes out of Boston. And they bought the rights to the Miss Marple series, and it was played here in America for a number of years and can still be found even today. So Agatha Christie had never been very happy with the film adaptations of her work. And according to her grandson, Matthew Pritchett, who handled her estate after her death, she didn't care much for the television series either. Joan Hickson, who played Miss Marple, says that the adaptations are mainly true to the original novels. She herself was 80 years old during most of the series production. Hickson also appeared in a stage adaptation of the novel Appointment with Death in 1946, after which Christie sent Hickson a note that read, "I hope one day you will play my dear Miss Marple," which she did many, many years later. So the regular characters in the story, there are two semi-regular characters. The first is an inspector who later becomes a superintendent, and his name is Slack, and he's played by David Horowitz. And the second is a constable who later becomes a sergeant, and his name is Lake. He was played by Ian Brimble. And they are the official detectives, and both, particularly Stack, originally dislike and are exasperated by Miss Marple. She is interfering with her methods, but they eventually come to respect. And in the case of Constable Like, they actually begin to like her at the end. Inspector Superintendent Slack is the senior officer in charge of many cases, and he is described as a man who has never striven more to contradict his name. A little joke there. Miss Marple describes him as having the same personality as that of a diesel engine, most unappealing but very efficient. When Slack first meets Miss Marple, her strange personality and quirky methods cause him to think she was batty, meaning crazy, and thus took no notice of her. Slack especially disliked the fact that his superiors think highly of Miss Marple and consult her for advice. And eventually, in the end, he does the same. Usually, Slack passes over Miss Marple's beliefs and dislikes her interfering, although he later comes to value her advice. In his final appearance, it is revealed that Slack has been promoted to superintendent and appears to have grown wiser, even telling an officer to consult Miss Marple. In They Do It With Mirrors, it is revealed that Slack has a secret passion for magic tricks and secretly practices magic. Constable Sergeant Lake is Slack's colleague and often works with him. He is also very amused by Miss Marple, her quirky ways, her unusual methods, and her claims of solving the case based on trivial stories from her past. However, the difference was, while Miss Marple annoyed Slack, Lake found her quite funny. By the time They Do It With Mirrors, Lake is on friendly terms with Miss Marple and also reveals he has a young son called Adam. When Slack is promoted, Lake gets more roles in the art of criminal investigation, but stays a sergeant. Lake is featured in the novel They Do It With Mirrors. This is from Masterpiece 50, an article from PBS that I just talked about. With a gentle smile and probing mind, Agatha Christie's Miss Marple often finds herself at the center of trouble, a witness to betrayals, poisonings, and all manner of mayhem. Knitting needles in hand and a cup of tea always at the ready, Marple quietly earns confidence while uncovering secrets and exposing killers. Miss Marple solves difficult crimes because of her shrewd intelligence, and St. Mary Mead over her lifetime. St. Mary Mead is the small village where most of these crimes take place. And this small little town has given her seemingly infinite examples of the negative side of human nature. Crimes always remind her of a parallel incident. although acquaintances may be bored by analogies that often lead her into a deeper realization about the true nature of a crime. She also has a remarkable ability to latch onto a casual comment and connect it to the case at hand. In several stories, she is able to rely on her acquaintances with Sir Henry Cleathering, a retired commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, for official information when it's required. In the Miss Marple novels, Marple typically solves the crimes through seeing analogies between the current events and suspect and the crimes and people she had encountered earlier in life. She had many encounters with the negative side of human nature and recognizes familiar patterns in the people around her. While Miss Marple's novels rarely offer background information on Jane Marple, she is mentioned to be from a well-to-do family of gentlemen and to have her own estate without ever working for a living. When in need of financial assistance, she relies on her nephew, Raymond West, a successful author. Miss Marple lives in the fictional village of St. Mary Mead. The village was introduced in Dame Agatha Christie's novel, The Mystery of the Blue Train, in 1928, which does not feature Marple. It was the home village of Catherine Gray, the novel's female co-protagonist. Agatha Christie published 12 Marple novels and 20 Marple short stories. So let's take a look at a couple of videos from Miss Marple, Agatha Christie. One is a trailer, and one is an interview with Julia McKenzie, who is the latest Miss Marple on the BBC PBS television series. Okay, so our song of the week is Hey Joe, made famous by Jimi Hendrix, but not written by Jimi Hendrix. And this is from the website songfacts.com. The phrase, Hey Joe, is something men in the Philippines often shout when they see an American. The Hendrix version omits the first verse, where Joe buys the gun. The first verse is, Hey Joe, where are you going with that money in your hand? Chasing my woman, she ran off with another man. Going downtown, buy me a 44. Hey Joe was written by a singer named Billy Roberts, who was part of the Greenwich Village folk scene in the early 60s. The song is structured as a conversation between two men, with Joe explaining to the other that he caught his woman cheating and plans to kill her. They talk again, and Joe explains that he did indeed shoot her and is heading to Mexico. This is the song that started it all for Jimi Hendrix. After being discharged from the Army in 1962, he worked as a backing musician for the Isley Brothers and Little Richard, and in 1966 performed under the name Jimmy James in the group Jimmy James and the Blue Flames. Hendrix introduced Hey Joe to the band and added it to their set list. During a show at the Greenwich Village Club Cafe Wah, Chase Chandler of the Animals was in the audience and knew instantly that Hendrix was the man to record the song. Chandler convinced Hendrix to join him in London, and he became Jimmy's producer and manager. Teaming Hendrix with Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell, Chandler had the group known as the Jimi Hendrix Experience, recorded Hey Joe and released it as a single in the UK in December 1966. It climbed to number 6 in February 1967 as Hendrix developed a reputation as an electrifying performer and wildly innovative guitarist. America was a tougher nut to crack when the song was released there in April. It went nowhere. A comment from the blog, Cat from Oregon. A commenter said this, Dennis from Anchorage, Alaska. I always found this song incredibly compelling, but I also have a fond, humorous memory of it. It was one of that generation who loved 60s music, while my parents, fans of Bing and Glenn Miller, hated it. Well, they put up with me playing Beatles records, and they could cope with Simon and Garfunkel and the Moody Blues or Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. But when I put on my disc of Jimmy's greatest hits, during this song, my usually very sweet mother told me, "Turn it off or she'll break the record into a million pieces." Had to listen to this one while they weren't at home. I know why your mom hated this song. It is a song about the murder of women by men they are lovers with because of the man's thrust to murder the woman. Men are going to murder their women, and they ain't gonna get strung up for it. It's 2020, and it's hardly changed. Women know this in their bones, have for generations upon centuries and centuries. We know what this song means. Jimmy sang it just right. He was half Cherokee First Nations, at least half. African and Cherokee heritage people, men and women, also know what murder for dominance looks and sounds like. Native American women know it most of all. Okay, quick comments about Jimi Hendrix, Hey Joe. Okay, so let's do a quick lesson wrap up for today. So we did a compare contrast to Poe, Doyle, and Agatha Christie in terms of timeline, when those stories were written and how history can change the story. They're all European. The first American detective series is called Charlie Chan, and that didn't come out until 1925. We compared the use of description within the use of the stories and how they differed. We talked about the physical differences in the detectives, and we talked about the style of detecting, and we talked a little bit about their motives for doing their detective work. So after that, we went into detail about the first half of the story, Murder on the Orient Express. Basically starts off in Syria, which really has nothing to do with our story, and ends up in Yugoslavia. We're introduced to all of the main characters in the story. We discovered that the story does relate to a real life event called The Lindbergh Kidnapping and Murders. We took a listen to the inspiration for the story, The Murder on the Orient Express. And we did a critical analysis by Simran Singh. We talked a little bit about the other character of Agatha Christie, Miss Marple. And by the way, on YouTube, there are several full-length shows of Miss Marple that you can watch. If you'd like to watch one, write about it, extra credit. Mystery music song of the week was Hey Joe by Jimi Hendrix. Well, not really written by Jimi Hendrix, but he certainly made it famous. But if you have listened all the way to this point here, let me give you the connection between the characters in the story Murder on the Orient Express and the Daisy Armstrong / Lindbergh kidnapping. And you're going to find this out at the end of the story, but if you've listened this far, take a listen here. This will help you in your reading. So, of course, we have Hercule Poirot, the world-famous detective. We have Mr. Bach, who's Poirot's friend and director of the train line. Dr. Constantine is a doctor. After the murder, he determines Ratchett's time of death. He's from Greece. Mrs. Hubbard is actually the grandmother of Daisy Armstrong, who is later revealed to be the actress Linda Arden. Interesting. Mary Debenham is a governess returning from Baghdad, who was really the former Daisy Armstrong governess. Colonel Arbuthnot was really a best friend of Colonel Armstrong, and he is in love with Mary Debenham. So the world turns. Princess Dragomirov is a Russian princess who is ultimately revealed to be Sonia Armstrong's godmother. Hector McQueen, Ratchett's personal secretary and translator, his father was the lawyer for the Armstrong family in the murder and kidnapping case. Ratchett, also known as Cassetti, was the kidnapper and murderer of the 3-year-old Daisy Armstrong. Countess Andrani was actually the sister of Sonia Armstrong, and notably as one and only of the 12 passengers who did not take part in the murder. Count Andrani, her husband, took the place of his wife as the 12th murderer. Cyrus Hardman, an American who was in love with Daisy's French nurse, who committed suicide after Daisy was killed. Antonio Foscarelli was Armstrong's former chauffeur who loved little Daisy. Greta Olson was Daisy Armstrong's former nurse. Hildegard Schmidt, Princess Dragomirov's maid, was formerly the Armstrongs' cook. Edward Howard Masterman Ratchett's valet, a remote and haughty man who was Colonel Armstrong's Batman in the war and valet in New York. The conductor, Pierre Michel, the train conductor and father of Daisy Armstrong's nursery maid who committed suicide after the murder. So this will give you some pretty clear, strong background for your next reading. As you're reading, you can maybe put the pieces together. There's a lot of moving parts here, and it's fine if you get them all confused because it is confusing. So the main question now is what happens at the end of the story. Okay, so thanks for watching. That's it for this week. We'll see you again next time. Bye.